Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to continue with the Cold War. We're going to look at part 4, the East and West develop. We're going to be looking at the Soviet Union and its satellite countries in the East and how the countries in the Western Europe and how they develop both economically and politically. And if there's any question whether they do so together, the photograph of the Berlin Wall should answer that question. Now, first we're going to look at the economic recovery in the West. Now, Western Europe experienced rapid economic growth. This has been referred to as the economic miracle. The city of Berlin had been bombed heavily during World War II. 90% of the city was destroyed. Yet, within 10 years, Western Berlin, as we see in this photograph here of the popular Kurfürstendamm Street, I always get that kind of mixed up. I've been on this street. Debbie and I were there a couple years ago, about 10 years ago. There's stores, there's department stores, restaurants. While Eastern Berlin was suffering terrible economy, Western Berlin was doing great. So now, why? Well, first is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild infrastructure. Highways, bridges, factories, harbors, all things that had been destroyed in the war. So this allowed Germany's economy to grow. Plus, leaders in the West wanted to avoid the economic stagnation that occurred after World War I. So they did everything they could to really recover the economies. Now, in politics, the Nazis had kind of discredited the old ideas and the old leaders. So new leaders appear, and they want political stability. Now we see a rise in Christian Democrats. This is a political party, the Christian Democratic parties in France, Italy, and West Germany. In fact, in West Germany, they ruled from after World War II until the 1960s, over 20 years. They rejected authoritarian and nationalism, extreme nationalism. All the things that were the causes for World War II. We're not going to do that again. They promised free market economies. They want to be able to have the economies grow in a capitalistic society. Again, this is contrary to the communism in the East. Now, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, they were part of the West, but had authoritarian regimes. They were very anti-communist governments. Greece, as we remember, we went through a brutal civil war, and they didn't, as much as they were authoritarian, they were very anti-communist. In fact, Spain's dictator, Francisco Franco, will remain in power until his death in 1975. Now, Britain and the Scandinavian countries, they adopt social democracy. And this is going to help build their economies, and they pretty much use it today. They haven't really changed. In 1957, 6 countries are going to come together and form the Common Market. It's a union of independent countries. They remove tariffs to create a single market. It's very similar to the way the states are in the United States. You could transport goods from New York to New Jersey to Pennsylvania, and you don't have to pay any taxes on them. They're going to do the same thing in their countries. Now, 6 countries do agree to come together. We have France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. So basically the low countries, and France, West Germany, and Italy, the 3 power countries in the center part. Britain refused to join at first. They do, this is going to be, as I mentioned, this common market will be the beginning of what will become the EU, or the European Union, that is in effect today. Britain tried to join in 1961, but it was blocked by President de Gaulle of France. We'll talk about that in a little bit when we get to de Gaulle. The UK did join in 1973, but have since voted to leave. This is the famous Brexit. Currently there are, well, they were 12 members. Without the United Kingdom, there will be 11 members as of today. In 1958, Charles de Gaulle, the French hero from the Second World War, is elected the president of France. He's going to return France to French nationalism. Now, de Gaulle sees the United States as a threat to European unity. Even goes so far as to pull French troops out of NATO. He says they're controlled by the U.S. De Gaulle and Eisenhower are not best buds anymore. We're now going to talk about the consumer revolution. Western Europe's economy is expanding. There's a rise in the standard of living. Like North America, Europeans bought modern appliances. More was manufactured and bought in Europe. In fact, the European auto industry, which had been very small and dominated by the American auto industry in the 1920s, expanded tremendously. In 1948, there were only 5 million cars in Europe, but by 1965, there were 44 million. Car companies in Europe like BMW, Volkswagen, Land Rover, Jaguar, Porsche, Lamborghini, Mercedes, Fiat, all started selling major cars, not just in Europe, also in the United States. Consumerism became a weapon in the Cold War. Now, this is one of the classic examples. Here we see Soviet, let me just indicate them. Let me see here. Here we go. We have, let me get a color here. Here we go. Here we have the Soviet Premier Khrushchev, and over here we have Vice President Richard Nixon. And they were having a discussion of the standard of living in each country during a World's Fair type exhibition in Moscow in 1959. This has been famously dubbed the kitchen debate. Nixon was talking about how great the American consumerism is and how we could buy washing machines and televisions and so on. This was far more than the Soviets had, but Khrushchev was bragging about how they were going to pass us by within 5 years. All right, so I just want to also point out this guy here. Let's keep him in mind. That's Leonid Brezhnev. He's going to come up later on. Just remember him. All right. Let me get rid of these marks here. Nixon, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev. Now, both the East and the West claimed they could better provide for their citizens. Western leaders were able to boast of stocked shelves in supermarkets and consumer goods and appliances in stores and department stores. So they were able to do that. The communist Eastern Bloc fell far behind in the standards of prosperity. Now we're going to talk about the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Now, the Soviets had defeated Nazi Germany and liberated Eastern Europe. That we already covered. Stalin starts moving the Soviet Union back towards a strict dictatorship. During the war, he loosened a lot of things. They used a lot of nationalism, trying to get the people all fired up to fight the war, the Great Patriotic War. But now that the war is over and Hitler is dead, Stalin starts moving the country back toward strict dictatorship. Now, Stalin had communist governments installed in the eastern countries they had liberated, and they're going to establish strict communist rule. Popular communist leaders were removed for ones that were stricter. They became more in line with Stalinist policies. Only Tito in Yugoslavia, as we mentioned before, was able to stand up to Stalin and remain independent. Now, the communist regimes led to economic hardships. This led to dissent among the people of the Eastern Bloc. There was actually an open revolt in East Berlin in 1953 by students and workers who were demanding better pay, but it was crushed by Soviet soldiers and tanks. The Eastern Bloc regimes became more hardline. Eastern Europe resembled the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Now, in 1953, Stalin dies. There he is. And Nikita Khrushchev, he's a more moderate Soviet leader, takes over. All right, let's bury Stalin. There he goes. Now, Stalin was originally buried in Lenin's tomb for about 9 years. He's not going to stay. Khrushchev wants to turn away from Stalin's strict policy. He actually starts a policy of de-Stalinization. Stalin was removed from Lenin's tomb and buried near the Kremlin wall, right behind the tomb. Statues of Stalin were removed. Names were changed. Stalingrad, which had the major war during the battle during the Second World War, was renamed after the river Volga, the Volga River, so it becomes Volgograd. There's actually a movement today to rename it Stalingrad, not because of Stalin. They want to, commemorate the famous battle that was fought there. Now, some Eastern Bloc countries wanted more freedom from Moscow, a little more independence. In 1956, Poland promised to stay in the Western Pact, but wanted more freedom, and they got it. Basically, freedom for the Catholic Church in Poland, and the Poland peasantry got a little more independence than that you would see in the Soviet Union with collectivization and farms. So Poland got some, but they said they would still stay in, the Warsaw Pact. Other countries like East Germany did not want reforms, and they're still very strict. There's Hungary. In 1956, Hungarian communist leaders revolt for more freedom. The revolution was led by workers and students in Budapest, the capital of Hungary. And it was led by a liberal communist named Imre Nagy. It's either Nagy or Nagy. Imre Nagy was a communist. They were not rejecting communism, but they wanted to have a little more freedom. Things were going well. They were negotiating, but then they went too far. As I said, they were going to keep communism, but wanted democracy. Here we see them protesting in the streets, of course, tearing down the head of Stalin. That was a given. They actually took control of some of the tanks, the Hungarian tanks, climbing on top of them, waving the Hungarian flag. But they decided to leave the Warsaw Pact, and they even asked the United States for help. This was something the Soviet Union could not allow because it would send a bad message to the other satellite nations. And as far as asking us for help, Eisenhower did not want to risk a war with the Soviet Union, so the U.S. doesn't help. So the Soviet army sends in tanks, they invade Hungary, and they brutally end the uprising. Over 2,500 Hungarians and 700 Soviet troops were killed, and about 200,000 Hungarians fled as refugees. Thousands of Hungarians were arrested. There were trials. Nagy and 229 others were executed. Now, at this point now, the West saw that the USSR would use military force to keep control, and any action against them would risk open war. In the 1956 Olympics, right after this uprising, which was being held in Australia, a fight broke out in a water polo match between the Hungarian team and the Soviet team. Not exactly sure what a fight among water polo players are, but I'm sure it was, considering the tension there was probably pretty bad. In 1996, a statue was erected commemorating Nagy in Budapest. Here we see a photograph of people putting flowers. I've read that not too long ago they did move it to another part of Budapest. Their politics are changing there in Hungary. Now we're going to talk about the Berlin Wall. Now, the Soviets tried to get control of West Berlin in 1948. Harry Truman instituted the Berlin Airlift, and that ended that plan. It failed. But Khrushchev wanted control of West Berlin. The problem was many East Germans continued to escape to the West through Berlin, and they were seeing a lot of especially young professionals leave, doctors and scientists and other people like that leaving, and he saw this like brain drain of their people leaving their country, and they wanted to stop that. So Khrushchev demands that West Berlin be given to him, but President Kennedy will not back down. So Khrushchev responds by building a wall through Berlin and Germany. Here we see in the early days, there was just putting up some cement blocks. That's a West German policeman on the West German side, but you can see the East German workers building the blocks and, you know, around Berlin. It started out very simple at first. And as you can see, it's going to get a little more complex. The wall eventually will have this rounded barrel type so people won't be able to climb over it. And then they'll eventually start destroying all the buildings near the wall. They'll be putting in barbed wire, anti-car trenches so you couldn't drive a car through, barbed wire fencing, machine guns, and an area you see there known as the death strip. If you move in there, they will shoot and kill you. Of course, on the West German side, graffiti artists had a lot of fun. They could approach the wall. No one's going to shoot at them. So they had a lot of fun painting the Berlin Wall from the west side. In fact, when the wall came down and they broke it up, they would send these parts of the Berlin Wall around the world as monuments. This one here is on the USS Intrepid over in New York Harbor. In the Hudson River. Now, the Berlin Wall will divide the city and the country. You'll see there's now checkpoints. This is the famous checkpoint Charlie. The military assigned checkpoints and gave it letters A, B, C, D, and so on. And the letters corresponding to names the Army uses, Abel, Baker, and Charlie. So this is checkpoint Charlie. Most of the kids in Berlin kind of just continue to, you know, live their lives as best they could. Now, people made attempts to escape to West Berlin. Many made it. This was a famous one of a East German border guard who was just doing a patrol there and then dropped his weapon, made a run for it, and jumped the barbed wire. In fact, the photograph became so famous, they actually even have a statue of it in Berlin. Unfortunately, 136 died trying. This includes 18-year-old Peter Fecht. He was actually shot by the East German Border Patrol, left lying there bleeding to death. The West Germans couldn't even get to him. Today I took this picture. We were in Berlin. It's a memorial to all those that died trying to escape the Berlin Wall. President Kennedy travels to Berlin. There he gives his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech. I'm going to play this here for you. Let's see if I can get this up here.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the word, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Yeah, that was the famous speech. YouTube is sometimes very difficult to deal with. That was a very famous speech. It was very popular there. The crowd was over 500,000 people. They even have a plaque there where he gave it. Here we see he was actually visiting. This is actually an area where you can go to Berlin and you could, from west side, you could look over the wall. You know, unfortunately, when they built the wall, families were divided up, husband and wives, parents, children, and they couldn't get to see each other. There were major restrictions. You couldn't travel anymore. So they used to kind of like meet at certain times and wave to each other. It's pretty sad. Here we see President Kennedy at this site looking over the wall. Here he is giving his famous speech. Now, we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the last major thing we're going to discuss today. Now, after the Bay of Pigs, which was a attempt by the CIA and some Cuban dissidents who had fled Castro, tried to invade Cuba, and it was a disaster. After that invasion, and the United States had been tied into it, the Cubans were paranoid, Castro, that is, was paranoid about the U.S. invading Cuba, and the Soviets, Khrushchev, promised to protect Cuba. So in October of 1962, the Soviets placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. We can see them here, the photograph. This is from these spy planes that traveled overhead. This is an actual, one of the missiles. It's in Cuba today, I guess is a monument or something. But these were the missiles, and they were in Cuba, and they're only 90 miles off the coast of the United States. So it is a major threat to the United States. Kennedy could not allow them to stay. Now, this is a direct challenge to the U.S. by the Soviets. Now, to avoid a war, Kennedy orders the U.S. Navy to put Cuba under a quarantine, not allowing any ships with missiles to go to Cuba. Some photographs here. There we are. These are some of the Cuban ships. The Soviet ships. If you look here on the ships, you could see up here, here. There are those are missiles are covered over. This other photograph is a little easier to see them here. Up here, back here. So it's kind of hard to pack up nuclear missiles. But there's the United States Navy pulling the, getting this Soviet freighter to turn around. Now, Kennedy was careful not to call it a blockade, since that would mean it was a war. So for 2 days, the U.S. and the Soviets were close to nuclear war. But luckily, both sides were quietly negotiating in the background. Khrushchev finally backed down and pulled the missiles out of Cuba. The Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, said afterwards, we were eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked. That's how close we came to a nuclear war. There were moments there where it came down to the vote of one Soviet naval officer that kept them from firing nuclear torpedoes at an American ship, which would easily escalated into a nuclear war. It was that close. Now the Soviets pulled the missiles out in exchange for the U.S. promise not to invade Cuba, and then we would pull our missiles 6 months later out of Turkey. Now a potential World War III was averted. And both sides, Khrushchev and Kennedy, came together to start discussions on reducing nuclear missiles. The enormity of how close the world came to thermonuclear war impelled Khrushchev to propose a far-reaching easing of tensions with the United States. Unfortunately for Khrushchev, his problems weren't over yet. The compromise embarrassed Khrushchev and the Soviet Union because the removal of the missiles from Turkey was a secret, so they looked like they backed down. In October of 1964, Khrushchev is ousted from power by the Politburo, led by the new Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev. That was the guy in that photograph I mentioned earlier. Keep an eye on him. Brezhnev was the leader of the Soviet Union through most of my childhood, high school, college, right, sweetheart? Right? He was Brezhnev. Yeah, Brezhnev was like leader, like it seemed, he was seen like leader forever. And his most distinguishing feature, if you look here in this photograph, are those eyebrows. Everyone used to talk about him. Look at those things. They look like two caterpillars crossing his forehead. In fact, there used to be cartoons about it. I killed as many people as there are hairs in my eyebrows. So he was very famous for those eyebrows. But he's going to be the leader of the Soviet Union into the, when did he die? I think it was like, it's hard to, it's getting very slow here. You would think that, here it is. I think it was in the 1980s, 1982. Yes, I remember that. We were, yeah. Yeah, he died in 1980. Yeah, he was the leader for 18 years. And under him, it was the Soviet Union was like so quiet, so secretive. Nothing got out of there. He had it clamped down for those 18 years. Now, Khrushchev's fall from power 2 years later was in part because of the Soviet Politburo's embarrassment at both Khrushchev's concession to the U.S. and as ineptitude in starting the crisis in the first place. They were first angry that he started it, and they were angry about the way he handled it. But he did live in his retirement until his death in 1971. So unlike the old days, they didn't just, in the Stalin days, they would just put a bullet in your head. Khrushchev was allowed to live in his retirement. Now, despite the uprisings and change in leadership, the USSR and its satellite nations achieved some stability. They continued to use military force and political repression to maintain control. But at this point now, both sides accepted the fact that Europe was divided into East and West and their spheres of influence between the communists in Moscow and, of course, the West, United States and Western Europe. They would continue the conflict in Africa, South America, and Asia. But as far as Europe was concerned, we will see there's one more rebellion in Czechoslovakia, but we're not going to see any more major conflicts between the East and the West. Well, that's it, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. At least you know that Khrushchev wasn't killed and Brezhnev had those eyebrows. He became actually a joke on late night television and so on. So Brezhnev and his eyebrows. All right, anyway, thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.